In the course of doing Nexus magazine, I get to meet and read lots of interesting people and read lots of interesting information. I'm sure. How many people here are familiar with the book The Keys of Enoch? How many people have read it? That's the sort of category I fit into. You start reading it and you realise, wow, this is really something to put down for a special time when you've got a few hours to digest it, because you know on the inside there's some very interesting stuff in there that feels really right. So I'm still waiting through my copy. I'll take some of the readers out here. Anyway, it's in my sort of job, you see a lot of speakers of interest. You hear reputations preceding them of they've got problems of ego or sex or they've just got weird, wonderful peculiarities. Our next speaker has got none of those that I've ever detected. He's one of the most enigmatic people I've seen or heard of on the circuit, and a couple of years ago at Glennis Mackay's UFO conference I was really intrigued because I thought James Hurtak's coming. I'm very keen to meet this guy. And he wandered over to my table and I sort of stood there sort of beaming away, sort of tidying up the magazines, fronting them towards him. And very interestingly, he made some comments on one or two articles which no one ever makes comments on. And they were articles which I considered really important. And one of the articles in particular was from Major Jordan's diaries, which is, in my opinion, it's proof positive that at the highest level the Cold War was a total hoax. It shows you how how America armed Russia with the nuclear weapons capabilities, etc., etc. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the two articles we ran. And when I put that article out into the internet, I thought Americans would be particularly irate. I thought they'd jump up in arms, and I thought it would really, rattle the sabre, because Here at Long Last was a book which had been really suppressed to the point that not many people had heard of it, and we were able to participate in resurrecting it. James came along and commented on the article and told me that he'd researched some of those facets and found them to be absolutely true, and complimented me on running the article. And there were several other articles he mentioned also, and I thought to myself, man, what an astute guy for picking on that, and that. So that prompted my decision this year to bring him out. I also had heard rumours the last time he was here that he showed a video after the UFO conference, and I must have been friends with about half of the audience, because the next day I got about 10 phone calls from people saying, Duncan, you should have seen this video he showed. It was under the pyramid at Giza and it had these temples, and it was just mind-blowing. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. I got on the phone, actually, I've got to tell you, I got on the phone to Hancock, Beauval, John Anthony West, and asked a whole host of so-called experts if they'd heard of the video you were showing, or they knew anything about the expedition that was on there. No one had heard a thing. Not a thing. So one other side thing I should mention, I noticed that James seems to have a tendency to come to Australia and release information into the public domain for the first time. One example of this was the face on Mars. Many of you probably associate that with Richard Hoagland, who sort of ran off with all the credit. But James here came out, what year? 80? 70?
It was published in 73.
Right. When did Channel 10 show the first footage that you...
Channel 10, 1984.
Yeah, 1984. So that's years before. That's what, 10 years before Hoagland, and the rest were...
And keep in mind the story is not true on that account.
Right, that's what we'd like to hear. So I'm hoping that he will. I know now, but I'm sure you'll find some more information coming out in today's lecture that hasn't been out in the rest of the world yet. The title of the talk is The Opening of the Time Doors in Egypt, Asia and the Pacific. And to give a bit of background information, James J. Hurtak, PhD, is founder and president of the Academy for Future Science and author of The Keys of Enoch. He's a social scientist, remote sensing specialist working in the field of archaeology, a former professor at California State University, Northridge and California State University, Los Angeles. His educational background includes the work at the University of California and the University of Minnesota. He was one of the consultants for the NBC award-winning documentary The Mystery of the Sphinx with Charlton Heston, which featured recent archaeological evidences on the Giza Plateau. He's worked directly with the scientists of Japan in the Okinawa in the first underwater documentation of the pyramid-like monuments with the team of Vincent Pace, who created the technology for the feature film Titanic. It doesn't say it here, but I know James was also an advisor or researcher for Sidney Sheldon's novel, The Doomsday Conspiracy. Did anyone read that? It's one of those airport paperback novels that you see there, but it's a fascinating read. And I read the book and I thought, wow, I wonder who nudged Sidney Sheldon with some of this information. Turned out to be James Hurtak. So please give him a big warm Nexus Conference welcome, and I'll leave you with him for the next 90 minutes.
Thank you, Duncan. It's a great privilege to be here in Australia at this meeting point of history where we're rushing into the 21st century. I'm going to cover some of my recent archaeological work in the Near East, and more recently here in the Far East, specifically on the floor of the Pacific Ocean. Before we get started, let me simply say that the documents represent research in progress. And because several scientists are involved with this research from Japan and in the Middle East from Egypt, some of this information is very, very sensitive, and thus I would appreciate no pictures being taken so an official document can be made through the Nexus management and family. Secondly, I have worked as an advisor in many programs, many universities, and think tanks, and the views that I present this morning are strictly those of my own research. Anything that may seem too super-rational or irrational is up to your selected factors. So please use your logic very, very carefully. Several of the exhibits are those of metaphor, historic symbolism, and cross-cultural analysis through remote sensing. So I ask you to be very, very patient with the presentation. If we can fasten our seatbelts, I would like to begin with the new image of man that is emerging in the 21st century, Homo noeticus, a humanity that understands that the construct of time can be transcended. A humanity that understands that we are just as much in space as space is within us. A humanity that understands there are tremendous breakthroughs around the corner. Some would call the research of zero-point energy and cold fusion as but a harbinger of a whole new field of consciousness quickening. And in this context, I would like to present a historic dimension of where past, present, future converge. I'm going to use as my point of departure the Book of Knowledge, Keys of Enoch. In Key 215, or Section 215, we are told that round numbers will appear, connecting the chiliocosm, or the multidimensionality of space and time, to various geometric forms that will be seen on this planet. On page 305 of my book, it is stated, key number 15 tells the children of light to look at the ancient megalithic sites at Teotihuacan, Palenque, Tiwanaku, the Tarim Basin, Stonehenge, the Great Pyramid, and the Sea of Galilee to see the round numbers and calculations of star mathematics, which are part of the greater astrophysical geometry. When this was written in 1973, few people understood the importance of Stonehenge juxtaposed next to the Great Pyramid, or the fact that the teachings speak of multiple Stonehenge areas or ancient calendar systems, like we see here, analyzed by Gerald Hawkins with an IBM computer, stand side by side the interesting phenomenon of the so-called crop circles, or round numbers, just as they were described. I talked to Colin Andrews. He was quite shocked that specific details were given in the keys, including phonetically the spelling of certain names that would appear in the field crop circles. We've all seen some of the interesting forms of the Julian sets, the Mandelbrot, and some of the other metamathematical symbols that have appeared in various areas around Stonehenge, more than 1,000 of these crop circles in the 80s, but this was written in 1973. The teaching thus coordinates certain mathematical calculations of activities in England and other parts of the world with specifics in Egypt. We see, for example, in 1991, a remarkable series of pictographic notations analyzed by Professor Michael Green as representation of the Egyptian name Amun-Ta. Here we have a clear identification of the work that's registered at Milk Hill. Dr. Gerald Hopkins has looked at this very, very carefully. He considers this an interesting possibility of a type of intelligence that is really not terrestrial, not using our forms of logic. And yet there it is. Something that is not looked at by many of the government scientists, an actual logogram of symbols that spell out a specific name. Now if we turn to the book of Knowledge, Keys of Enoch, in 1973, I state the word Amun-Kuta in terms of certain mathematical geometric codes that will be written upon the earth. What am I saying? There's a connection between what I was shown in my higher consciousness experience between the programmers, the celestial architects, and the trumpet call of awakening the human race to realize Matthew 24 is knocking on your door. And all due respect to Jeremy Lee, Jeremiah the prophet also blows the trumpets. And we have to take seriously, in spite of the smokescreen of all of the geopolitical scenarios that tend to move our mind into great despair, that there is help on the way. And this is the work of Enoch over the Stonehenge area. Just a few years back, in 1994, one of my colleagues captured this picture of a capstone, a pyramidal-like vehicle that appeared, known also as the Merkaba, the ancient prophetic word for the divine vehicle. Not a flying saucer, not a metallic spaceship, but something that shows the higher architecture upon which Stonehenge, the Great Pyramid, and the Oriental temples and those of the Native Americans all point to the heavens, which means we are part of an upward evolution. We are not meant to be destroyed by the powers that be, no matter what camouflage of the extreme left or the right. We read carefully the symbols, then we are of the upwing. The higher imprint of knowledge that we have received in our ancient text, if we read it very, very carefully, tells us a remarkable story. And here I quote from the Nag Hammadi text of Asclepius. This is found in Egypt in 1945. The text tells us, "Are you ignorant, O Asclepius, that Egypt is the image of heaven? Moreover, it is the dwelling place of heaven and all the forces that are in heaven. And if it is proper for us to speak the truth, our land is the temple of the world. And it is proper for you not to be ignorant that a time will come in it when the Egyptians will seem to have served the divinity in vain, and all their activity and their religion will be despised. For all divinity will leave Egypt and will flee upward to heaven." It's quite a remarkable statement. It means that the early Coptic Christians realized that the symbols in Egypt, the tombs, the so-called mystery stones, were part of an architecture that went back to a much earlier period of time. More recently, in 1998, scholars and Egyptologists were shocked to find the existence of another Stonehenge, that in southern Egypt, next to the Sudanese border. And here we see some of the outcroppings of these small stones, upwards of 2 or 3 meters in height. Next, we see the measurements of these stones that are placed in circles and alignments very, very similar to what we have in England and other parts of the world megalithic centers. More specifically, this being orientated with the major planets, the solar movement, and also the orientation with Regulus. So we can have the first view graph. We see the area of the megalithic sites at an area called Napta, close to the Sudanese border, measuring from the orientation of the monolith. There is a grid of several megalithic points going over several thousand meters, and scientists, by analyzing the cattle burial regions, the bone fragments, have carbon dated this going back to some 8,000, 9,000 years ago. This would put this area close to the end of the last ice age, in about 9,000 BC, and also would throw light on the activity of an astrophysical priesthood that could make very substantial and sophisticated measurements of solar and lunar movements. These are not simple food gatherers. They were connected with the vast system that we now know from radar analysis of underground radar rivers, as they are called, that run up and down the Nile. Next, view graph. Looking more carefully at the outcroppings, we see the standing stones, the lines of sight, the southwest window of the circles it is called, the standing monoliths. Again, complete absence of light as we know, but we know if we look beneath the sand cover by approximately 4 to 6 meters, we see a different Egypt, an area that was very, very different, an environment that could sustain human mobility and traffic. We go to our slides. So as we reconstruct the face of Egypt with remote sensing technology, we move into a whole different cycle of history. Berosus, the great historian, cited by Pliny the Elder, speaks of time cycles going back 490,000 years BC. Diodorus of Sicily, who chronicles the gods and the heroes of antiquity, speaks of Egypt going back some 33,000 years. Manetho, the great priest historian, speaks of a time cycle of 24,927 years where gods and human architects worked side by side. George the Cincillus speaks about 25 Celtic cycles or divine cycles of 36,525 years. And if we look at some of the findings in Ethiopia and Sudan, such as the Kibra Nagash texts, we have a very interesting story regarding Solomon and the Queen of Sheba in our Bible. We are told, among the presents that Solomon gave to the Queen of Sheba were, quote, a vessel wherein one could travel over the sea, and a vessel wherein one could travel by air. Does this mean that there was some type of celestial navigation? We see, if we look at the upper right-hand side of this pictograph, a strange reptilian being. I'm circling with the small laser. We see a human subject with wing-like appendages, a being that has a sphere around the face, and also the sacred cattle, or the Apis bull, which represents the tombs of Saqqara, the 4 sons that represent the divisions of the human race, and very interesting notations that are magnified in the lower left-hand side of the screen of a treasury of ancient documents and records that were placed beneath the ground that would throw light on the earlier experiment that was brought to this planet by the divinities of the higher worlds. In the 1970s, I requested permission to go to Egypt to do research regarding the blueprint of the Keys of Enoch, and I had an opportunity to use laser technology, to use musical technology, and later in the 1990s, again, my colleagues of the Academy for Future Science found themselves working with a close-up of the documentation of alleged rooms beneath the paws of the Sphinx. Here we see an aerial perspective of some of the areas that are being cleared away. The amphitheater before the Sphinx proper has been removed. The German Egyptologists have been successful in finding a strata of tunnels, and the whole complex of Egypt has changed since Robert Schoch and John Anthony West stated that the water lines show great fluvial activity Hence, Egypt was not dry, that some 10 to 12,000 years before, there was great water activity that would have cut into the sides of the Sphinx. Signatures going some 1 to 2 meters deep. Now let us take a closer look at the symbolism here, and please stay with me, because the text that we're finding an avalanche of new records in Egypt tell us. In that day, that country that was more pious than all countries will become impious. No longer will it be full of temples, but it will be full of tombs. Neither will it be full of gods, but it will be full of corpses. O Egypt, even Egypt will become like the fables. And what is to be said about this? The Egyptians, for they, the Egyptians, will not abandon Egypt. For in that time, when the gods have abandoned the land of Egypt and have fled upwards into the heavens, then all Egypt will die. Namely, there is a scenario here, even in the Christian text, that points to the importance of this symbol. Next, the work that was done in the 70s with colleagues from Stanford Research Institute, using transducers and seismic equipment, allowed various pictograms or micrographs of information, as we see here in this cone-like series of patterns, to show where openings or tunnels or vaults existed under the sand. We see here the counterpart to the footprints of the camel on the surface next to one of the pyramids. Thus, by looking very, very carefully at the echo patterns of the return movements of the thumping of the hoof, seismologists, remote sensing experts could detect the possible entrance of other rooms. Next, here we look now at the reality behind the Sphinx, the pause of the Sphinx, not the newly restored pause. Next, what is said here on the stela of Thutmose III, that beneath the Sphinx there is a grid-like system of cubicles or geometries that would house the prehistory of the gods or the heroes of the ancients. And one takes this in the context of neo-Egyptology and paraphysics, it means that there is a counterpart even to the Sphinx that is buried there somewhere along the Nile. It gives us a clue as to where these underground rooms and chambers are. We are told in our Bible in Genesis 49 of the great blessing that Jacob gives to one of his sons. Verse 9 of chapter 49 of Genesis, a lion cub Judah is. From the prey, my son, you will certainly go up. He bowed down. He stretched himself out like a lion, or Sphinx, and like a lion. Who dares rouse him? The scepter will not turn aside from Judah, neither the commander's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh or the Messiah comes, and to him the obedience of the peoples will belong. Esoteric Christianity has taken this to be the sign of finding special rooms. And so with permission, we're going to show you now some of our findings on the back side of the Great Sphinx that connect not only with underground passages, but also with the entrance into the pyramid complex of Giza and Kefren, Giza and Cheops. We see here the inside of the Sphinx. We see a hollow tube, according to my colleague Dr. Dolphin, one of the leading scientists at Stanford Research Institute. In the complex, there was found a water capsule area some 9 feet deep, which was used for ritual initiation or some type of baptism. Why the hollow interior? Let us turn now to our first video document. We turn off our cameras. We see Dr. Zawi Hawass
has been never opened before. Nobody really knows what's inside this heaven. But we are going to open it for the first time.
Our team climbing down the interior inside the Sphinx. And I showed the trailer of Dr. Hawass because in a jovial fashion he agreed that there may be other openings.
Oh, Gil, did you?
But we were interested in bringing down the technology and actually checking out the perspectives. And the biblical account of the 7 years of famine were years where there was storage of special documents that go back to a much earlier phase of history. We look at the reconstruction of the possibility of a second Sphinx. The second Sphinx is on the horizon as Regulus. The great Roman astronomer Claudius Ptolemy, about 135 BC, wrote of the 27 principal stars of magnitude 1 to 6 in Regulus. But also, if you look at the reconstruction and the pictures of the Sphinx on the horizon, you will see that there are lines connected with the underground portals of the Sphinx. That is to say, there are matching connections. They go approximately back to 10,000 to 12,000 BC. Regulus also is a very important area because it is the area of the immediate universe where we have the highest concentration of gamma ray radiations. It is a symbol that repeats itself as the jaguar in the temples of Mesoamerica and the lion in the temples of China and the Orient. So what am I saying? I'm saying that there is a much higher meaning to the lion symbol that even Jesus refers to in the Gospel of Thomas, where we must assimilate the power of the lion and put on the face of the lion as the symbol of the sun. Using the radiations of light, we shall then complete the initiation, understand the symbolism of Egypt and ascend to the higher worlds. Stanford research scholars also have used thermal infrared remote sensing to look at the sides of the three major pyramids of Giza. As we see here, the infrared image of the pyramids show concave and convex mirror-like effects during the day cycle. And the pyramids are mathematically constructed in such a perfect orientation as to suggest other relationships, not only with the pyramids, but also the rotation of Saturn in terms of the magnetic and geomagnetic influences of the nearby planets. The three pyramids, according to Enoch, represent the Bible in stone. The capstone that is missing represents the final stage of our human evolution reaching up. And using the energy technology and the spiritual technology, if they can use that term, to complete the linkage with the higher worlds. Here in 1977, two of my students, working with lasers, looking at the so-called air shafts and star shafts on the north and south side of the Great Pyramid, are pictured in a higher state of meditation. More recent expeditions, however, have been focused with the understanding that the symbolism of the Pyramidion, or the symbolic capstone in the Museum of Cairo, represents nothing less than the three stars of Orion's belt, the region of Imtsak, aligned with our sun, our solar evolution, and they in turn will open our eyes to see that we are connected with a greater evolution, connected with the Kolob, as it is called, or the central sun, the wings of which descend at a time that we have completed a certain stage of evolution. Paraphysically, the capstone completes the next phase of that evolution. Now, the Egyptians planned to place a capstone on the Great Pyramid next year. The French have been commissioned to work with this artificial capstone. We'll see what happens when this takes place. We can have the lights once again. The Coptic text tells us of wondrous stones that will be found. And the Arab historians of the 10th, 11th, and 12th century speak of stones like glass, one can see through. What had happened to these wondrous stones, these wonderful objects? We're just beginning to find out in the 1990s, particularly through the work of Rudolf Gottenbrink in Germany. We were electrified to find that there were other possibilities with the so-called star shafts in the King's and Queen's chamber. May I have the lights in the foreground turned off? Immediate lights. By comparison, I hold my small tape recorder next to one of the stellar openings in the King's chamber, so you can see how relatively small these are. So I wonder, well, how could these be used as stellar shafts? Because some of them were closed up by masonry and stones weighing from 2 to 20 tons. Conceivably, at an earlier stage of evolution, before the capstone or the upper part of the pyramid was complete, the lower portion still could have been used as an astrophysical area or platform for measurement. In 1973, we published, 20 years before Robert Bevell, the coordination of the star shafts going on the south side to the belt of Orion, on the north side to the circumpolar stars in the system of Alpha Draconis, Ursa Major. I can use my laser beam to connect now the Queen's chamber with that of the King's chamber, namely the prophets called the Abba and the Imma, the father and the mother side of creation, whereas the early Coptic Christians saw in the Eye of Horus the side view of the eye profile. We see the ability to see creation either through positive programming of star birth, syntropy, or the negative death of the stars or planetary worlds called entropy, negative entropy. All of this is seen in terms of a model of still yet another phase that we as human beings can go through. And that is the induction entrainment of being in this and similar structures where the certain sounds of mantric vibration or prayers can raise our consciousness to a level where the mind begins to harness and use other parts of its sleeping self. Sacred geometries appear and literally higher beings of intelligence manifest themselves. Now this happened a few years ago when Robert Watts was with us in Egypt. He was atheistic. He deplored the concept that the Egyptians actually had a higher logic behind the acoustical properties of their great chambers. But in listening to the certain mantric sounds that we used, Robert Watts, also shifted into an altered state of consciousness. What is being said here in this picture is if we use musical sounds, we will find the subharmonics, the other complementary aspects to the rooms yet to be opened where documents will be found. And in some unique way, rather than reaching to the left or the right, the north or the south star shaft, we will align ourselves directly with their own meta-programming. In other words, we will realize the pyramid represents our body in stone. The King's chamber and the coffer, the human race in this part of the electromagnetic spectrum. In March of 1993, Gottenbrink and his associates built this very unique Upalot small robotic system with cables, fiber optic materials, and many of you have seen from the international documentaries. With special cameras, they were able to go up one of the star shafts and bring back a report until some 60 plus meters into the sides of the Great Pyramid, a small door with copper hinges or copper hearts was seen. We believe that behind the door there is still yet another chamber, possibly connected with the name of Osiris or Amun-Ra. And this is the reason that there is such a unique coordination that is going on with the symbols throughout the world, coordinated with the meta-symbols that were there originally in Egypt. By using other musical technology and techniques, we were able to enter into some of the side chambers behind the king's and queen's chamber. Chambers that were filled with sand used by the masons as they left the major pyramidal rooms after they were constructed. This suggests the architecture of an original pyramid on top of which the present pyramid was built. In these side chambers, we found interesting notations suggesting that they were used many times in the reinforcement of the pyramid, later Egyptian dynasties. Here we are pictured in 1970, 97, 98, with some of the small ground-penetrating radar systems. This was the first systematic attempt to look at the tunnels yet to be found beneath the small pyramids as they relate to the so-called King's and Queen's Chamber. We were quite successful in documenting a series of pathways that suggested that there were at least tunnels on 3 different levels. We see one series that was uncovered by the German Egyptologists that some believe were used as boat pits. The question is, what are boats doing in the desert? Unless they symbolically represent the coming of the architects or gods in the early moment of prehistory. Were these pits used for some type of water initiation? Dr. Hawass believes that the blood and the water would collect here, and these were areas of purification. There are many theories, and so one has to be rather careful, but the fact of the matter is there are multiple levels of these tunnels running all throughout Giza, which becomes more and more like an astrophysical computer, showing alignments with star systems over very long periods of times of tens of thousands of years. We go now to the underground sanctuary, the region of Rostau, the region of Osiris, the god of the underworld, the prototype of Christ, according to the Coptic Christians. And we look at a recent documentary that was on international television in February, March of 1999. Again, I ask that the cameras be turned off.
2 years ago, an American research team
2 years
came to
ago,
Giza
he
and
doesn't
using
name it.
ground-penetrating radar reported odd readings underneath the Sphinx. The findings suggested the possibility of an underground chamber. More recently, however, Dr. Hawass discovered just that, a subterranean chamber. And it lies at the bottom of a long shaft not far from the Sphinx. This long hidden chamber honors the greatest of Egyptian gods, Osiris. In ancient myth, he's the principal figure of the country's genesis, a benevolent god king who brought civilization to Egypt, but then was brutally murdered by his brother. Osiris was reborn as the Lord of Eternity, ruler of the dead, the chief judge at the trial of all souls. And as we now learn, he is part of the wonders at Giza.
Maury, we talk so much about dispelling myths. How about confirming one? About 2,500 years ago, the Greek historian Herodotus, who I guess you could call the world's first foreign correspondent, visited this site. Local villagers and guides told him that he could find the tomb of a king buried deep beneath the Giza Plateau. Well, about a year ago, Dr. Zahi Hawass, who joins me here at the mouth of the shaft, embarked on what he calls his greatest adventure ever. Zahi, you've been doing this for some 30 years. Why is this so amazing?
You know, Susie, it's amazing because this is the first time that they excavate underneath 100 feet in water. Before, I excavate on sand and dirt. And also at the same time, I discovered that this is what Herodotus talked about. And I found that this is the tomb of Osiris. Let's go and see what we're talking about.
Our first descent is about 20 feet, a chance to get warmed up to the rickety, rusty ladders. Now it gets intimidating. The second leg is a major drop, as the shaft narrows before opening to a room once obscured by dirt and sand. Zahi and his men cleared it to find a burial chamber with 6 rooms.
Note that chamber with the open rooms.
So this is the second level, 55 feet down, right?
Yeah,
What did you find here?
You know, I excavated this part. I found 6 rooms cut in the rock, 2 red granite sarcophagus, and pottery, and...
It just so happens that bone fragments are poured on the floor,
bones tell us about
somewhat
the
like an
people.
Easter egg hunt.
Pottery gave me the date of this place, 500 BC, 2,500 years ago.
And what made you think that there was anything beyond this?
You have to look for the other level. This is the adventure. Let me take you to show you the most amazing thing that you'll ever see in your life. But let us take our jackets off because it's so hot there.
All of the hydraulic equipment has been conveniently removed from the second level for this documentary.
Oh my. Upon discovery, the 3rd level was submerged. When the water was pumped out, Dr. Hawass had the find of his life.
Here we have the sides of the
No fear of the
so-called
unknown?
Osiris tomb.
Yes, but there is great adventure in archaeology.
And here we have the subchamber, approximately 100 feet, for 33 plus meters beneath the sands of Giza. We see here the so-called lid of the coffer.
What is this?
Susie, this is the tomb of Osiris.
The god of the underworld. This once extravagant mausoleum, a moat with 4 pillars engraved with hieroglyphics constructed thousands of years ago, was intended to be a symbolic shrine for the keeper of the afterlife.
If you will look down here, I will show you what is here. Look, there is the second part of the sarcophagus. Goes down, I think about 1 feet down. And up, you see what we did. The lid is up. You want to see the length of that lid? Okay, let us watch out. Let us
How
see.
much would something like this weigh?
Oh, the weight of this was 11 to 12 tons. What's the length?
Just about 9 feet.
9 feet. Then the whole lid and the second part is about 11 to 12 tons weight.
And how could they get 12 tons down 100 feet?
You know, when they cut the shaft, they fill the shaft with sand, and they cut side shafts. They take the sand from the side shafts, and the sarcophagus will come down piece by piece.
And there's more. Archaeologists agree that below the Giza Plateau lies a network of tunnels. Could this be the center? A gateway? Our first evidence is stunningly revealed.
I will go now and show you this exciting place.
Take a look at this side on the wall now.
Zahi, the American prophet Edgar Cayce talked years and years ago about a lost civilization, hidden tunnels that would lead to answers about it. Could this have anything to do with that?
You know, Susie, Edgar Cayce and lost civilization, it's a legend, it's a myth. The Arabs in the last century, they talked about all of this, and psychic brought it to us back. But to be fair, I did not excavate this tunnel yet. Then
No,
really, I don't
we were the
know
ones who did it.
when it meets us. But I always say that you never know what the sand and the tunnels of Egypt may hide of secrets.
Zahi, thank you so much for allowing us to experience this adventure with you.
So this was the telecast. 2 years ago, before this event, as some of you know, my last visit, it was our team that went down who discovered the coffer, the lid. And here are some pictures from this amazing expedition where we brought our own lights. There was no lighting available, and so we had to bring 220 watts with batteries, portable systems, the whole works. This is done very carefully because of the water trough and because of a labyrinthine system that could easily electrocute a person if they were carrying electrical apparatus. We see the speaker connected with one of the tombs on the second level down. Note the regularity and the near perfect patterns of how these large, massive tombs were cut. And the coffer itself has a very interesting machine-like edge on the four sides, suggesting that this meticulous work was brought in from above or below with great hydraulic finesse. Desiree, my wife, is pictured here with some of the apparatus we had to bring to the lower depths. It was very, very difficult to breathe the deeper we went. But we were able to take inventory of the first of a series of very large rooms. As I stated before, some of these rooms were very, very massive, like those one finds in ancient cathedrals. The openings were obviously there as a part of a much earlier strata of architecture. In the three major traditions of the Middle East, the Judaic, the Christian, and the Islamic, there's a great reverence to Idris, or Enoch, as he is called, and a recognition that Enoch is the scholar, the scribe. It shows the baseline, the water complex of a much earlier city. We believe that what we're seeing here is one of the water areas of a vast hydraulic system that connected Giza proper with an ancient lake, and also the Mediterranean proper. With very sophisticated computers and our battery systems, we were able to take measurements, and we were able to move across the water with inflatable boats. Next. And now we turn off the cameras again. We'll see the original film of our going down into the lower depths. Come on now. Will you move over? Lowering. The ladders were brought in long before Dr. Hawass made his profound announcements. Special lighting is used. And we see on the series of the three levels the first of a series of remarkable rooms. Again, it's very difficult to see in the absence of ambient light with the use of simple flares and small artificial light sources. There's a series of massive coffers. We can see here some of the water apparatus, and certainly not the bone fragments that were conveniently poured on the floor for the sake of the Fox television special. The building of the Aswan Dam, Lake Nasser, 1961, by the Soviets, allowed the water levels to reach up and flood the temple baseline of many of the great temples along the Nile. And as a consequence, many of these lower temples were out of reach by professional teams until recently. We see the smooth sides of one of the openings of the interior, or one of the massive coffers weighing between 12 and 20 tons. Some of them larger than the openings of the actual rooms, suggesting that these were symbolic models. Here we see with the pipes and the pumping apparatus that was removed to pull out the water from the lower depths. And then as we descend to a much lower elevation, some 33 plus meters, we see some interesting details of areas that lead off in different directions, suggesting the labyrinthian mazeway that Enoch has predicted in the Book of Knowledge. More specifically, aspects of the ancient city of Enoch that the Bible speaks of. Other geologists and archaeologists make the descent. This had to be done in small groups because it was difficult to breathe. Once you get the full impact of what it means to be beneath the earth, in the realm of Rastao, the underworld, and what this means for present history, because if documents are found, they would not only mobilize the three major religions to recognize a higher source, a much earlier source, where Jesus as the Christ child was brought to Egypt. Moses was there in Egypt. The great prophets and patriarchs all show reference to Egypt before it was defiled in the pharaonic periods. But if earlier documents could be found, then the Greek, the Egyptian, the ancient historians could speak.
That was it, great.
That we are finding, as it were, the blueprint of the experiment that is now coming to completion. That we were an experiment that was brought to this world. We look now at the sides of some of the water channels, the moat, and the bottom parts of alleged pillars that were on the four sides of the Osiris tomb. I have to be very careful, for I do not believe this is the only Osiris tomb. For all of the tombs in the lower part of Egypt reference Osiris as Lord of the Dead. Here we see the rooms that were cut. This was a work in progress that was pushing out. And on the other side, we see the opening that Dr. Hawass was standing before in the 1999 special.
One more time. Go long.
In 1973, I was shown the underground labyrinthian system, and so I could not believe it when my wife and I were there some 25 years later, exactly in the place where we use remote sensing and remote viewing to find the openings. Not only the openings, but also the top of the sarcophagus that Hawass and company take credit for. So if we can stop at this point, go back to our documents. Next. We see here the lid and the human footprint. See the Nike? Here is the top of the 9-foot-long coffer lid, weighing some 12 tons. It's still embedded in the floor. You can see the apparatus around. This is the proof that our research team was there first. We were the ones who found not only the openings to the sacred chamber, but we know this connects with a whole avalanche of history about to open. This connects with the return of the architects, or to use the terminology of Mircea Eliade, the great anthropologist, orientalist, the myth of the eternal return. The guardians, the angelics, the architects come back to salvage the experiment of the human race. We see here another area that was uncovered. Next. The speaker is standing also in one of the underground rooms, of which there are many. Showing that there was a previous period before the classical period of some 3000 BC and the dynastic kingship lists. We see here one of the moat areas. We see our technicians being very, very careful not to fall into the water with the apparatus. This did happen. Fortunately, the apparatus was not connected at that point. And rather than being 1 foot deep, it was 3 feet in one place. We saw some very interesting details suggesting that some of these collection areas were used as batteries It would have provided the power necessary for those who are doing the tunneling underground. If we have to bring the power system down to see all the details, obviously the ancient civil engineers and architects had to have some light source. And of course the Egyptian texts speak of these wondrous lights. So whether your tradition is of the Christian, the Judaic, or the Islamic, or of the Eastern traditions, there is reference to a superluminal light source or higher power that was used in the creation of these great tombs, which were not really tombs, but they were schools, libraries, academies, places on the earth marking a grid pattern from east to west, from north to south, where the human race was being evolved and tested over periods of time. That is coming now into a harvest period. Another series of tests that we did were a series of musical tests. Here I am with the coffer of the king's chamber. And we were able to bring computers inside for the first time and record a whole series of electronically generated pure tones. We found that they were diminished into inaudible ranges. That is to say, we couldn't hear them, but the computers were able to pick up the tonal qualities and the acoustical qualities, and by marking the points of extreme resonance produced along the trajectory of a certain path with electronic measuring devices, an outline or portrait of the acoustical architecture of the terminal environment was produced. Meaning that anyone stepping into the king's coffer, the granite, reddish granite, would note that this is the part we as human beings occupy, the reddish portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. The resonance that we captured was 90 cycles per second F, 180 cycles per second F, 270 cycles per second C, 360 cycles per second F sharp. In other words, there were very precise patterns of musical tuning. On this earlier map that I published, we see at the top of the schematic the color spectrum from red to dark purple in terms of cycles per second on the basis of the Bohr atom or hydrogen red 0.0000 6547 centimeters. We found that certain sounds and acoustical properties, when acted upon, would produce certain metaphysical and paraphysical forms, as we see here at the bottom of the screen. Circles, triangles, pentagons, pentagons within pentagons, Mandela-like structures could be produced in a fashion similar to that which Hans Jenny, the great Swiss paraphysicist musicologist, did. I want to play some music as we go into meditation and experience what I call the crossing of the three veils of light, or three-dimensionality, as portrayed in the ancient text. So whether we go to the Egyptian Book of the Dead or the Coptic texts of the early Christians, or even the Sufi, we will recognize that the open tomb was to represent where we were within the greater evolutionary track of the universe. And when we could activate certain energies, we would produce a certain vortical door, morphogenic door that would open. And our mind would then receive the other symbols that would come through this great pyramidal system as a great musical transformer, a great computer transformer. The rooms, thus, are part of the amplification of our body as the temple of the Holy Spirit, according to one theory. If we can have the music, we have created now some sounds of the ancient resonance of the Holy, 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 the Sanctus, the Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. Listen. As we go through the face of the Sphinx and Einstein, relativity is conquered. We come off our cross of space and time. line of Judah is assimilated. It is our face on the Sphinx. We are the initiates. And the Bible in stone speaks. The cosmic door is opened. And the symbolism of Egypt is understood on a much higher level. The great chambers begin to open. Sacred science. And then all temples are seen as the footstool of the Lord, if the divine names of God are used. Beneath the ocean, upon the mountains, we speak. The pyramid is the ancient eyes and is called by the prophets the rock of truth, or by Isaiah, the pillar in the desert bears witness to the coming of the Trinity and the Godhead. Or as the mystics would say, the White Brotherhood. And far beneath the pyramid in the Giza Plateau, the other rooms begin to speak. This place is of instruction and initiation, where the early Christians met, where the manifestations of the Virgin were seen. The architecture points to the heavenly Jerusalem, which shares the same mathematical design, with 22 sevenths, or pi. The architecture of the Old Testament that places the bodies of the patriarchs, that opens to the right sounds, the right words, the right prayers. Appears to us, the golden octave. We put on bodies of light, so to speak, that which the keys of Enoch refer to is the Guia Christu, the garment of the Christ. We're going to stop at this point of the music. This is one of the many music documents we have that you can acquire from the Academy. These sounds then are specific harmonics that were part of an agreed-upon tuning intended for the increase of creative consciousness and for the active entrainment of the human psyche to altered states of consciousness that would take the initiate psyche through increasing states of liberation, creativity, or inner psychological movements of ascension, associated with the imperishable architects of Egypt who lived in the stars, connected with the realm of the Elohim. Now, the keys of Enoch tell us that besides Egypt, in the world grid system, in the Near East, there are also places in Central Asia, in Russia, in the Tarim Basin, of Western China, and also in the islands off of Taiwan and Japan, Yonaguni. I want you to pay attention, for these are the areas where we have worked very carefully with the keys of Enoch to open up the time vaults or time doors, to find the missing pieces of earlier history of the Adamic race. With permission of the Academy of Science, in China I was allowed to make a brief expedition in the 1980s into the Tarim Basin, and here I'm walking on top of one of the ancient hydraulic systems. These are massive waterways that run for literally hundreds of miles to the mountains, bringing water to cities. Now, of course, abandoned, these cities represent the earliest building blocks of human civilization, and the mummies that have been found beneath some of these ruins predate the Egyptian mummies. In the 1950s, Chinese and Russian anthropologists had the opportunity to explore some of these ancient cities that seem to be sitting on the bottom of an ancient lake bed. We see the erosion lines where there were massive water movements, hula activity. And we see from the Book of Knowledge one of the pictures of one of the cities in Central Asia on top of one of the large mountains with no roads leading up. It seems to be there as a result of chemical or vibratory lasers that were used to make cuts in near perfect markings in the side of the mountain face. Inside of one of these cities, spherical documents were found that had a cobalt vibration. Some of these documents were removed to Russia. In 1991, the Chinese found in the region of Lop Nor strange bodies. Those near the surface, of course, reflected the various nomadic peoples that moved across the steppes of Asia in the last 2,000 to 3,000 years, but they found also a strange aspect of a pre-Chinese people, very much like the Celts, a people that may symbolize a proto-existence of a parent group in Central Asia that broke off, a portion of which went to Europe, a portion of which went to North India, a portion of which went to present-day China on the east side of the Eurasian landmass. We see here the mummified specimen. I was allowed to go beneath the earth, and I saw some of the exhibits. Some of them closer to the surface had racial features like the Hungarians, like the peoples of East Europe, the clothing of which was used. And there's a great debate going on now between anthropologists in the United States at the University of Pennsylvania and China as to who really brought the wheel to the Far East. Did it come from these very special people, or did it come from a very noble people that were there in a pre-strut of history? Here we see the face of one being that looks very much like a mountaineer from Switzerland with a strange star map or solar sign on his face. The Gurdjieff spoke of the brotherhood of the sun, Sangmong, and sought to find the ancient brotherhood. This is an area that Buddhist tradition would call Shambhala, where the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, the great avatars, came down from the higher worlds, bringing the knowledge of temple building, mathematics, and liberation. So what happened in China, the Chinese were very careful not to bring out this material at first because it showed that there was not a socialist model for the history of China, that these people had a vast talent in building hydraulic systems, which is a sign of higher civilization, had a vast communication system and a great mobility. In the Russian area of the near Tarim Basin, Datu Uri Mochanov recently has work with artifacts going back some 200,000 years. In a statement before the American Academy of Science, he speaks of unusual fossilized animal remains, and by a special dating technique using electron penetration, he finds that there are exhibits that go at least back some 14,000 years, showing that the world is much earlier in terms of Homo noeticus. A brief map which will show this particular area, which according to the teachings of the Book of Knowledge, Keys of Enoch, was the area of the Gan Eden, or the area of the Genesis account. And these lakes here are the remnant of a great flood, of a water catastrophe that took place, pushing people into the Black Sea area and other people into Kazakhstan, and still other peoples into the Mongolian steppes. Now, the Oriental heritage is very profound because it also contains documents of beings that came from the sun. In other words, if you look authentically at the ancient documents, they do not present a picture of Darwinistic evolution, whether it is pre-Buddhistic Taoistic or pre-Taoistic, or Togarian, or that of Eastern Europe, or Aryan or pre-Aryan, that of North India. Clearly, the sons of light came from the higher worlds to this planet. Klei-u, as they're called in Tibetan, and they will return again when the blueprint is complete, when the time doors are open and the knowledge is brought up from the deep. Now we move to the next grid point, which is that area encircled here in Ryukyus, off the island of Taiwan. In the island of Okinawa, we see a small cluster of jimas. Miyako Jima, we see Yonaguni Jima. It is here where we have done recent research. Next. We go to our third document. With special permission, you are honored to see this. Document number 3. You turn off the cameras,
a
please.
professional scuba diver who lives on Yonaguni. In 1986, Arataki made an astonishing discovery. He found what appeared to be a giant stone structure of some kind, rising majestically upward from the bottom of the ocean at a depth of 100 feet. Arataki approached Okinawa's prestigious university of the Ryukyus. He described his find to Dr. Masaaki Kimura, a professor of marine geology. Professor Kimura couldn't believe it. A castle beneath the sea? Impossible! But Arataki insisted. Finally, Professor Kimura loaned him an underwater camera, and Arataki soon returned with pictures of his find. Impressed but not convinced, Professor Kimura sent some of his students to investigate. They returned with tales of several giant stone monuments in the area, and finally, Professor Kimura made the first of many visits to Yonaguni. Professor Kimura and his students began a careful study of the site, measuring and recording various angles and dimensions. They even built a scale model of the structure.
9 different levels.
I must confess that when I first heard Arataki's story, I didn't believe a word of it. But now, my students and I have been studying the Yonaguni monument for almost 9 years. I am fully convinced that this was once a natural rock formation, which was later shaped by intelligent beings into an inspiring structure, a structure which has since been copied by many cultures in Japan, Central and South America, and in many of the islands of the Pacific, such as Tonga, Ponape, and Easter Island. Look at these 90-degree angles here at the base of this wall, and again over here by these steps. My students have found clear indications of tool marks in several places. Look at these proportions, which are almost perfect, architecturally speaking. The structure could be an ancient shrine, possibly celebrating a deity resembling the god Nirakanai, who, the locals say, brought happiness to the people of Okinawa from beyond the sea. This could be evidence of a new culture, as there are no records of a people intelligent enough to have built such a monument 13,000 years ago.
Wait a minute, 13,000 years ago? Where did that date come from? All the history I've ever read teaches us that the only people on Earth in those days were primitive hunter-gatherers.
We're going to stop at this point. We have only limited
There
time
are only
left.
two possibilities that would explain the presence of a 350-foot stone monument at the bottom of the ocean.
We just have to stop
The
at this point.
structure could have sunk as the...
You're going to see this. Well, I'm sorry we have just so much time here, but in the future presentation in Brisbane, I'm going to show you the actual pyramids. You'll be visited by underwater technology that worked with the Titanic excavations in the North Atlantic. This is a brief schematic of the movements of people then from Asia who brought the knowledge of pyramid building, temple building, across the Pacific to areas of Indonesia, even Australia, as we have seen by the recent headlines. The human record goes back at least 6,000 to 8,000 years, and then to the South American boundaries. With all due respect for our time slot, I want to move then to our final documentary on the Merkaba, which is going to tie this together. This is a picture of how the temples above land and under the ocean tie together paraphysically and metaphysically. So with all due respect, we're going to take a look at a assortment and interpretation of these temples that the Keys of Enoch predicted would be found in Japan, 1973, are now being found at 122 degrees longitude east. With precision, we know the keys are accurate. The temple steps, all of which point to activity the ancients regarded in the lands of Lemuria and Mu. These structures fulfill that part of Scripture that speaks of the foundations of the deep being moved prior to the coming of the Messiah or Messianic age. We go to our Merkaba document, which is part of the meditation capstone. The divine name of names, the Ancient of Days, shall open up, as we are told in the Keys of Enoch, the house of many mansions. My role is the infinite species, the infinite seed within this house of many mansions. And no more will there be any curse, but the throne of God and of the Lamb will be there in the city, and glory and love. We are one, the jewel eye. And night will be no more, and they have no need of lamplight or sunlight, for God will shed light upon them. And so, beloved, we are here as a light unto the nations. Let this be our higher work. We who reach for the heavens shall receive the light and the signs. The image of the hierarchy and the image of the Trinity are patterned at all of the temples of the world, which were the original work of the architects known as the Order of Melchizedek. Reclaiming our past, we open the future door to work with the cosmic Christ, the coming of the Son of Man, and the coming of the dove, the quickening of the Spirit, and the coming of Alpha and Omega, that unites us, salutes us, unifies us in the gathering of the 12 tribes. The image of Jeremiah the prophet and Isaiah is fulfilled, and John the Divine rejoices with us. And so we are blessed. Our courage to be the humanity of the 21st century. Amen, 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 and amen. This documentary has won 3 gold medals. It's available through our information booths. It's being translated into many languages. It's a depiction of what we found beneath Egypt and in the oceans of the Pacific. So again, I thank you for your patience with us. We thank Duncan for making this happen. And we're just at the beginning of taking back the planet. So trumpets of Jeremy Lee and Jeremiah the prophet together, you have a quickening of what's about to happen when the White Brotherhood makes its manifestation. There'll be a cosmic cleanup very quickly. Anyway, we have a wonderful period of the Congress that's going to continue, and I will be available for questions and answers privately. Again, we thank you, Desiree and I, for the moments that we've had to share with you, and those who can make it to our future summit in Brisbane, there will be more documentation on the actual pyramids that we found in the Pacific. Once again, thank you.